Hi, my name's Katie Payton, and I'm talking to Daniel Mendelsohn. Daniel's the author of Waiting for the Barbarians, Essays from the Classics to Pop Culture, which has been nominated in the category of criticism for a National Book Critics Circle Award in 2012. We're here at New School in New York City. So for our talk, I wanted to ask you about some of the topics that you've said are interesting and relevant to you, which is the reality problem, television, and classical precedents.
Okay.
But I want to start with a really basic question. Do you write about what interests you, or do you try to think about your body of criticism as a coherent body of work that tells a story about society?
No, I would say definitely not the latter. I don't think any working writer, well, I certainly don't think of my body of work. When you're a working writer, you're thinking of hitting your next deadline and getting paid, basically. So that's what I take things on because they're interesting to me, and I have close relationships with the New York Review of Books, the New Yorker, my editors there. So we generally just look at what's out there and pick the things that are interesting. So in some large sense, you're creating your body of work because you're always looking at things that are interesting to you. So that has its own kind of coherence, I would say.
Makes sense. In the introduction to Waiting for the Barbarians, you write that the reality problem is the preeminent cultural event of our day, and references to it crop up more than once here. And you also said in an interview with The Millions that you think the most interesting thing going on in culture right now is television. I want to read a quote from your essay about memoir, but enough about me. And the quote is, "If you can watch a real lonely suburban housewife yearning after young hunks on a reality dating show, why bother with Emma Bovary? The premium placed on these shows on the spontaneous expression of genuine and extreme emotions has justified setups that are all too obviously unreal. In a word, fictional." What is the classical precedent for reality television?
Well, the ancients had healthy enough doses of real reality, what we now have to call real reality, that I don't think they needed anything like reality television. I mean, certainly there was a point at which I was sort of working up an essay about the Roman games as a kind of reality television, before there was such a thing. So certainly, there was this. My interest in reality TV, which goes back pretty much to the start, was about trying to figure out why at this moment suddenly these allegedly real entertainments and the kind of emotions that they generated and the setups that were produced to make people have real people have real emotions rather than actors pretending to have emotions, and why that was happening right then. And so I looked to the Roman games, as a kind of precedent. It was interesting because, the games in their most extreme form, were intended to satisfy a sort of disenfranchised, politically disenfranchised population in the city of Rome. And so, my conclusion was that these fake reality is a kind of compensation for not having the real reality of being politically engaged, as a people.
In The Wizard, you perceive the argument in Avatar that reality is dispensable altogether, or at the very least, what you care to make of it, provided you have the right gadgets. And in discussing memoir and fiction, you take it a step further and say that reality itself is a term that's being rapidly devalued, and that the difference between memoir and fiction may ultimately have as much to do with the reader as it does with the writer. So I wanted to ask you, who's your ideal reader, and how has that person been affected by these things, by reality television and the reality problem you talk about?
Well, I think that, I think I was interested again in this reality issue as it applies to literature. Now we're getting away from television, uh, because of the reactions that have occurred when allegedly real or factual writing, memoir particularly, turns out to have been doctored. So it's in fact fiction. You thought you were getting fact, but it turns out you're getting fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And so that to me again seemed to be recapitulating the terms of this general argument about what's real in the culture and what do people want out of reality. Why do we why do we need memoirs to be true? We've always needed memoirs to be true. Since St. Augustine, we've needed memoirs to be true. And I'm always interested when the reaction to a phony memoir is, well, it may not be true. And you got a lot of this, for example, with James Fry, right? It may not be fact, or it may not be true, but I still got so much out of it. And then the question I raise is, well, writing, making up stories and having people relate to them and get something out of it, is an age-old practice, and it's called writing a novel, right? So why, we're in this funny moment where these categories are being blurred. Is it a novel? Is it a memoir? Do people care? I think that when people stop caring, it's a kind of dangerous moment, because there is in fact a difference between what happened and what has been invented. So I think, as I said it in that passage that you quoted, it's obviously it comes from the reader. You're telling a story, you're making it up, you're a novelist, you're reporting things that actually happened to you, you're a memoirist. But also what interests me more and more is the audience response. Do people care if there's a difference? And if they don't care, what does that mean? Strange times.
That's well, and a lot of your criticism, a lot of it feels like there's aspects of memoir in there, like the stories that you get people interested in who you are and why they should believe your opinion. So that's really interesting.
Well, yes, I think that's an interesting point, because criticism is another genre in which the personal and the observed, let's call it, interact in a very potent way. And I think not enough attention has been directed towards what the proper balance of the personal and sort of, as it were, scientific observation in criticism ought to be. But there's no denying that both are present. You can't, I think the critic who pretends that she or he is in some way totally objective, can't possibly be right, because it's all one's own, the way you see things and the way you interpret them is constituted by who you are, temperamentally, intellectually. So it is deeply personal, and yet it also has to be available to other people who are not you. That's the trick.
So you state in your essay, Unsinkable, that when the Titanic sank, so did a sense of optimism and the technological confidence of an era. And in The Wizard, you link James Cameron's Avatar, where technology builds a better world, to the viewpoint advocated by the wizard in The Wizard of Oz, who uses technology to create his own powers. But in Oz, the heroine leaves the world and comes home when Jake of Avatar remains in Pandora. You write that in this way, Avatar is the movie for our time. And I thought that was a really powerful statement. I'd really like to hear you talk a little bit more about it at this moment in history, how that's...
Well, I think it is, again, it feeds into this overriding interest that I have in, our ability to distinguish between, as it were, private realities and public or real realities, right? And
didn't mean to bring you back to that.
No, well, I'm always coming back to it, because, as I said, I do think this is the big issue. And I was very struck watching Avatar, which is a movie, as you know from my review, which I admired greatly in many ways. I mean, the politics are screwy, and everyone, thank you, everyone talked about the politics and Pocahontas and Dances with Wolves and blah blah blah. But that aside, I thought it was really a remarkable movie in many ways. And Cameron himself has talked about how the great experience of his life as a young moviegoer was seeing The Wizard of Oz. So I thought it was sort of fair to invoke The Wizard of Oz. And what's so interesting about The Wizard of Oz is, like analogy. Jake in Avatar, Dorothy goes to this strange land. She has to fend for herself. She learns how to communicate, as it were, with the natives and learn their way of doing things, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of The Wizard of Oz, it goes back to black and white, right? Very significantly, she goes back to Kansas. And the suggestion is, it's obviously a kind of maturation narrative, right? She She, she learns from having visited Oz, but then she goes back to reality, and presumably will somehow is now a more enhanced person. What was so interesting to me about Avatar is that he decides to stay in Oz, basically, and in that sense, I thought, it is the movie of our time because we do have, these objects now, handhelds and iPhones and earbuds and all of, these are ways of creating our own walking private realities wherever we go. Right? You're walking down Fifth Avenue, but you're not really walking down Fifth Avenue because you're listening to your music and you're checking your stock quotes and you're talking to your friend and you're texting your professor and blah, blah, blah. So we've allowed ourselves to have these sort of private bubbles of our reality. And that, I think, is sort of new, in the history of technology. And I think our obsession with this stuff, we can't put these things away. We love being able to carry our private realities wherever we go. It's manifested in a choice, like the choice that Cameron made in this movie. So he decides that he likes this reality better, so he's going to stick with it. And I just thought it was interesting,
So we're all in Oz.
So we're all in Oz, right.
Okay, I have one more question. Writing about Barry Day's collected letters of Noël Coward, you quote Day, "One wonders what history will make of the present illiterate email era." And I wanted to ask what your opinion on that question was. How do you think our correspondence will be viewed by future generations?
Right. Well, I just want to emphasize that's his quote.
Yes.
He said our illiterate email era, which it is what it is. We can't all wish it was 1924 when people were writing copious letters. Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, obviously, the nature of written communication has drastically changed, and I think to some extent it's moot for me to sit here saying whether I like it or not because it's going to happen. I mean, there are certain things about written letters that one misses. There was necessarily a kind of sobriety and carefulness about writing to people when you actually had to go through this process of sitting down, taking out a pen or a typewriter, and the instantaneity and casualness of email, I don't think have enhanced the art of epistolary communication, let's put it that way, right? But this is how we live now. And I think the real problem with email, it's funny because I'm doing this event tonight with John Freeman, who wrote this whole book about email. It's like these other gadgets that we have. It enhances or adds to this kind of frenzied pace where one is always living in expectation of being contacted, right? So, you used to get your mail once a day. The mail came, you read your mail, you answered your mail, and then you didn't think about mail for another 23 hours, right? And now, as you know, we spend all of our time, it's like, I feel like I'm playing this insane game of ping pong all day long where you're just sort of swatting these things aside. So I think it's yet another kind of manic demand on our time. I also think because of just the nature of emails, and we all know this, they tend to be shorter, more to the point, more efficient, whatever. A whole genre is dying. And I'm not saying it's good, it's bad, it's just an observation. When you look at, the collections of correspondences of writers, there's a whole kind of world there because the communication was more formal, more thoughtful, more longer, there were certain sort of formal considerations. And I don't know, I don't know what it's going to be like. But I'll end with this funny story, which is that my alma mater had contacted me about eventually getting my papers. So I said to them, I said, well, I have boxes and boxes of letters from when people still wrote letters, going up to, say, the mid-90s, early 90s. I said, but then it's all just, email, obviously. And I said, how do you preserve that if you end up having my archives, my papers? And they said, oh, well, the first thing that we do is we print everything out, So I thought that was so great. It's like the revenge of paper. They say because, you know, paper is still the most stable medium. You know, you never know how digital stuff is going to change. You have zip drives, floppies, 3.5-inch floppies, 5-inch. All of that's very unreliable. So we just print everything out. So I thought that's kind of funny.
There's nothing like just handing someone a letter too.
Yeah,
just
right.
Holding it in your hand.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for being with me.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks for answering my questions.
Sure.
And